talking about intersex and you're talking about transgender, but for me this is related, because if people are born in between, like in terms of physical manifestation, right?
Sure.
So then why should they have to choose I'm a male or a female if they were not born a male or a female? Like, yeah, that's my question.
Okay,
for you.
so I'm going to go back to answering your question.
Yeah.
All of this was very imperative in answering your question, because you said biological realities, people need to read a textbook, and then you mentioned how somebody expresses themselves, how they identify. There are two different issues. I'd like to address them separately if we can.
But they're
because
not
I
separate.
agree.
That
because
is my
I
question. You
well,
said
let me
you were
answer.
going to answer my question.
I am answering your question.
If people are biologically
so if we take
born
away, I'm just going to
physically
keep talking as though you're polite here. So if we take intersex and we take, for example,
it's not polite to question
Kleinfelders.
people's existence.
We take, for example, intersex, we take Kleinfelders, we take genetic anomalies that are very outside of the norm.
Referencing Kleinfelders.
So for example, there's some people, we've talked about this earlier, there are some people who are born without feet. There are some people who are born with webbed hands. There are some people who are born with 12 fingers and toes. But if what we teach in biology class is that human beings have 2 arms, 2 legs, 2 feet, 10 fingers and toes. We don't teach biology, we don't identify biology based on certain based on outsiders. Yeah, we don't. That's not how we teach biology.
So
That's not how doctors treat biology. So let me go to your. So I want to separate what we were talking about there: intersex and a very small percentage versus transgenderism. People who choose to identify who aren't born that way. But because you keep pressuring me on that, let's go to intersex. Let me ask you this: were you among the statistical reality where you had some very distinct primary sex characteristics as intersex? Because the vast majority of people born intersex are not LGBTQAIP activists. They're people who are born with very clearly identifying traits. It's not just right in between. The vast majority have micro penis and large clitoris, internal testes, and it's pretty easy to identify. So was that the case with you?
Yes, I was identified at birth as being intersex.
Okay, but not everyone is, because as I mentioned, was it the case where you were identified as a female pretty quickly? You had primary sex-defining traits in that of a female?
Well, I was assigned a female because of the choice of the doctor that worked on me, right? But like I was born in between. So for me, like a doctor made a choice that even though I was born in between, even though they knew because of a what's that called? Amniocentesis. Mm-hmm. So they knew before I was born that I had XY chromosomes, but because I was born with a vagina, they knew that I was intersex, but because there's a doctor, again, who plays God and makes a decision because it's all what's going to go on the birth certificate, I was assigned female at birth.
Okay, so you didn't transition later on in life?
No.
Okay. So my question again for you is just because the statistics would reflect that the overwhelming majority of people born intersex are not just born directly in between the two. There's a very clear delineation with identifying sexual characteristics with male and female.
That's so not true. There's chimerism.
If we remove intersex and very small percentage of outliers, let's say it's the 1.7. I don't agree, but we'll go with that. Now we're addressing the transgender issue. That gender is a spectrum. So
yes.
Why? How many genders are there? Why do we go with that? Because that's very separate from genetic anomalies of intersex.
Right. Gender is a societal construct. So, as my boss mentioned, there is a spectrum. So some people identify purely female or purely male. Some people identify in between. You already talked about the different pronouns that are available. And it's based on your something intrinsic that you were born with in your head. So we've proven, for example, that in terms of sexual orientation, that being gay is not a disorder. It's just like a biological reality. It's a human condition, right? And being transgender is the same thing. It's like you're born. There's actually studies that have come out now that transgender brains more closely align with the gender of the brain that they identify with than the brain of how they were born.
Can I address that?
Sure.
I have a question there. So you said, I want to make sure I'm not misrepresenting your view. You said gender is a societal construct. Those were your words.
It is, yeah.
Okay.
It is.
So if gender is a societal construct, how can there be a male brain and a female brain, as you just described?
Because there are brains that fit, like, more, if we're thinking about a spectrum, right? Like, there's brains that fall here on the spectrum, brains that fall here on the spectrum. What society is referring to as a male brain, whether that person was born, regardless of their genitalia and their physical presentation to the world, their brains are more similar in certain ways. And that is because there's a spectrum of types of brains. And so there's a brain that's like that, and then there's a brain that's slightly to the right on the spectrum, and then one that's slightly to the right of that. And there's this whole spectrum of types of brains, just as there is a spectrum of types of skin color or facial hair, all these different things that we've talked about, right? And so what we have found is there is actually a correlation between this identity and a brain that looks a certain way. So people aren't making something up. It's like something that intrinsically that they are born feeling and identifying in this way, right?
Feeling and identifying in a way, okay?
Yeah.
And this is important because the biology and the identification are two very different things. So I'm going to continue along the premise which you originally expressed. There is, I certainly agree with the biology. There is a biologically defined male brain and female brain. They're different. They operate differently. There are different developments and different portions of the brain. They fire differently. They have different levels of neurotransmitters, and they respond to stimuli differently. There is a male brain and a female brain, absolutely.
And
there are some anomalies. There are some very acute number of outliers in between, but not much.
Huge.
There is a male brain and a female brain. Okay, well, the entire world exists on a spectrum, and then there are limitless genders and limitless brains. How do you determine what's right with the literature? How do you run a scientific study if you're saying there's a limitless number of brain types and a limitless number of identification types? How do you line that up as a study?
If myself does not threaten your daily existence, then why do you care?
It does. It does. It doesn't threaten my existence. I believe the restructuring of Western civilization based on, I don't believe gender is fundamentally interchangeable. I don't believe men and women are interchangeable.
So only Western civilization is right, is what you're saying? Because
that's a different conversation, but yes.
Really?
Yes.
So the whole white supremacist and Western perception of society is what is right?
I don't believe white supremacy is right at all.
Well, Western civilization is arguably founded by the colonization by white people of people of color that existed already.
No, Western
in
civilization
Native
is not
America
founded on white
Americas.
supremacy at all. So I believe Western civilization, the civilization that allows people to live freely, the civilization that freed slaves, the civilization that brought you that iPhone technology, paved roads, plumbing. The Romans did that earlier on, but it was very primitive. Yeah, I believe Western civilization is right. And a fundamental role in Western civilization is that of male and female. And I believe that that is very important as it relates to what we teach children, very important as to how we rear children, very important as to how we jail people if we're going to define pronouns, if we're going to define gender identification. I think it's important if we're going to change the entire fabric, the makeup, to identify what it is.